safeguard they're considering in number 9 against domestic faction and insurrection. So not only do you, like, it's kind of obvious that you would want to be unified among the states to protect yourselves against foreign threats, but domestic faction and insurrection was also a huge threat that they were considering how to protect themselves against. So in number 9, Hamilton goes through his solution, and basically he says there's a few safeguards that the new political scientists have come up with for Republican government to prevent the problems with Republican government that they experienced in the past. So I'll just give a nice list of these if you have this edition. It's like the second page of number 9 Federalist paper. He says, okay, what are these principles? The regular distribution of power into distinct departments, so separation of powers. The introduction of legislative balances and checks. The institution of courts composed of judges holding their offices during good behavior. The representation of the people in the legislature by deputies of their own elections, so representative government. These are all the ways that Republican government are sort of remedying the defects of republicanism in the past, according to Hamilton. But he adds on another one, another big one that he's focused on, and that is the enlargement of the orbit within which such systems are to revolve, either in respect to the dimensions of a single state or to the consolidation of several smaller states into one great confederacy. So this idea of enlarging the orbit. So you're going to protect republicanism somehow by enlarging its orbit. So that's what Madison is continuing to explore in Federalist 10. So then if we look at Federalist 10, just to make sure we're understanding sort of what are they trying to remedy? And Madison calls these mortal diseases of popular government. So what is his sense of the mortal diseases? Like, what are the death knell of popular government? What is likely to kill it? What kinds of things?
Would it be something like giving normal people too much power?
Giving who?
Like normal people too much power.
Giving normal people too much power? Could you elaborate a little bit?
Like into our government, like the common people, they didn't want them in government.
Well, like, I mean, there is a problem. There's a kernel of a problem in there that you're, I think, heading towards. Yeah. Injustice? Yeah. So he gives a sort of summary list. He says instability, injustice, and confusion. So instability, Republican governments, sort of the death blow to Republican governments is when they are unstable, unjust, and confused. So having too much involvement, you could say, of ordinary people might contribute to confusion or something like that, right? It's very hard to coordinate masses of opinions. And in fact, one of the reasons why that I'm going to mention is, and that Hamilton has already alluded to, is that representative government is supposed to be kind of a filter. You're supposed to get sort of like, a winnowing of the best kinds of people who are well suited for leadership, which then the people still have a say, but they are not directly saying what they think. They are doing it through their representatives who have a set of skills and abilities that, not everyone has. It's supposed to be, that's ideally how representative government functions. And then what about injustice? Why is injustice sort of a death knell to Republican government? Yeah.
Kind of like also bouncing off of that one, like pure democracy is like obviously the founders were big on the Greeks. So like they saw the injustice happen with Plato or Socrates?
Socrates,
yeah. Like where pure democracy, even though it's obviously not doing something bad, it was like unjust because the consensus voted on it.
Yeah.
So I think that he's saying that it's kind of like going off the last one, confusion. Like when there's too much going on, it's very easy for it to become unjust and popular opinion to swing its representatives.
Right, and so there's something like a government, insofar as it could be called a republic, actually has to be just. That the moment that you could look at a republic and say that republic is unjust, it's actually not a republic anymore. And that could be for reasons something like that, where it's devolved into kind of like a majority rule, pure majority rule. We're going gonna see what's wrong with that in a minute here. Because the majority can decree things that are like absolutely unjust, like putting to death Socrates, who all he did was go around asking questions of people, you know. Heaven forbid we actually like think freely or speak freely. They put him to death for that. Okay, so so what's this kind of leads into my next question, is that if you leave these diseases untreated, like how were the authors of this, like Madison, like what did he think was actually at stake? Yeah.
So they were kind of worried about that in bringing their country to revolution, that they'd be stuck in a process of revolution. And so their biggest concern was actually the falling apart of the union itself, like that they couldn't be together anymore because people would be so divided over injustice and more or less that like there would just kind of be this internal mob rule, which really isn't like this unity that they're seeking, right?
Yeah, that's partly it, is that it would devolve to something like mob rule, or it would just be chaos, not an orderly system of government. Remember, if the whole point of agreeing to live under somebody else's rule is that you think your life will be better off, you think you'll be more secure in your life, liberty, and property, chaos is not conducive to that sort of thing. Mob rule is not conducive to that sort of thing. And he says, I think, let me see if I can find one here. Yeah, he has this line here. Complaints are everywhere heard from our most considerate and virtuous citizens, equally the friends of public and private faith and of public and personal liberty. It's just such a short little line, but I think it's well worth pointing out and reflecting on as much as we can. What is at stake is that public and private faith. So what do you think that means, public and private faith? That unless we secure these conditions, we will no longer be able to have public faith or private faith. Yeah.
I think it's like kind of talking about like Locke's property, like property of yourself.
So the public faith mean like that sort of trust that you can like make contracts and have security, that kind of thing. Yeah, I think that the public faith means that you no longer can trust the officials or the government to do what they are there to do, and you can no longer trust citizens at large to act in a way that's going to be for the security of your liberty, etc. And you can no longer have public and personal liberty. So public liberty, how would public or personal liberty, can you think of how those would be distinguished from each other?
Like what you do in your own home versus what you do like downtown or in the streets.
Yeah, that might be a start. Like personal liberty, like sort of what you do in your, privacy, in your private capacity as a citizen. So can you think of how, like, failing to, or how injustice, instability, confusion, how would that affect your private liberty, your ability to do what you want in your own home, on your own time?
Doesn't there need to be, isn't he kind of saying like, how do I say this? That like there needs to be, like he's talking about confusion. So if I'm at home, but I'm confused about what it is that I'm allowed to do because things are constantly changing kind of based on going with the wind of what the public wants, then I'm not truly free. Is that kind of what you're getting at, or am I off base?
No, I think that's heading in the right direction. And I mean, if you think about it, like, in order to have private liberty, like, you need to have the means to act, even, right? Like, we generally don't think of people who are, like, in dire poverty at being at liberty to do what they want, right? Like, they don't have the basic means to be able to survive, so they're kind of enslaved to just scrounging whatever they can to just, like, basic survival. They're not really free to do what they would want to do. So, I mean, you just think of it in basic sense, like in a regime where there's confusion over how to provide basic security, for example, your path to your place where you get your livelihood, your job or your employment or whatever, if you're always at risk of being robbed on the way home for whatever you manage to make during the day, that is not gonna be conducive to your private liberty, right? So I think we can think of like that as like there's a connection between the public and what's going on in the realm of the federal government here and what is happening in your own daily lives, is what he's getting at. And then what would be public liberty? So you, public liberty.
Would that be like what kind of like business like you can do, like if you're using the same like going to and fro work, like the work could be considered like a public liberty, like if you have like a carpentry shop, whether or not there was like heavy taxes or
Right.
regulations on,
Mhm.
you know, how thick the legs had to be changing or whatever.
Right, if you had some sort of setup where it's like, the manufacturer was completely being just raked over the coals and taken advantage of by some, legislative body that, you know, had their own interests competing against theirs, then that would be like, I think, a public, also public interest in the sense of public liberty. Like, think of just like the Bill of Rights, like First Amendment, Second Amendment, start to think through those, your public ability to say, to criticize government officials, like, hey, look, you're totally ruling unjustly here. That liberty would not be secured in a system that's unjust, chaotic, and it's, what's the first one? Such a nice, unstable. Okay, moving on. So that's what's at stake. There's a lot at stake. So then he gets into this idea of faction. He's continuing this point from Hamilton. But we're going to enlarge the orbit of the Republic, and that is going to help us deal with internal factions somehow. So how does Madison define faction?
That it's just like a group of people motivated with a common goal, essentially.
Basically, yeah. It's it's a number of citizens. It could be a minority or a majority. But that number is a faction when it becomes united by some common impulse of passion or of interest, adverse to the rights. So it's not just, okay, let's have a few conditions. It has to be a group. It could be a minority or a majority group. It has to be a group. It has to be united by some common interest or passion. But to be a faction, that interest or passion has to also be opposed to the rights, or it's adverse to the rights of other citizens, or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community as a whole. So there's some sort of interest that a group has that puts it at odds with either another group within that whole or against the whole itself. So that's what a faction is. Now he identifies there's some causes of factions. He says there's only two ways you can deal with factions. You can look at their causes and deal with those, or you can look to their effects and deal with those. So he says, first you can take on the causes of factions. You just, cut it out of the root. Seems like such a good practical solution. You're gonna take care of it, get rid of the causes, get rid of faction forever. So to understand what this is, you have to understand what are the causes of faction. So the first cause of faction, he says, is the liberty which is essential to its existence. So faction is inextricably intertwined with liberty. If you did not have liberty, you would not have faction. Why is that the case? Yeah.
If I'm a dictator, I can break up factions, do all kinds of things. So like, freedom gives people the right to form groups that may not always be the best for society at large.
Exactly, yeah, right? You couldn't be that group, you couldn't be that faction if you were just taken out of existence the moment that you cohered as an interest, a recognizable interest, potentially at odds. So as long as there's liberty, you're gonna have faction, is what Madison is saying. Now, why would you not want to just destroy the cause of faction in this sense? By destroying liberty. Get rid of liberty, you could have have all these nice things. You could have stability. You could have justice. You could have certainty, lack of confusion. I mean, it sounds like, I think at face value, like something, oh yeah, you're reading this as an American, you're like, yeah, we never want to take away liberty. But isn't that kind of attractive, actually? What does Madison say? Does anyone remember what Madison's response is to this? Because there's the remedy, strong government, lack of confusion, certainty, imposition of justice. I would get rid of faction. Get rid of liberty. It's a sort of main rebuttal to that.
He says of like abolishing factions, is like the same as abolishing liberty, which is the same, which is essential to political life. He equates it as the annihilation of air.
Right. Like you could, to take an extreme example, you could save the environment by destroying humanity, which ruins the environment, right? That would solve the problem. And that would be a case where, as he says, the remedy is worse than the disease, because that has a name. It's called genocide, which is something that human beings tend to recognize as something that is unjust and wrong. And interestingly, the connection to, he associates it with it's liberty as being essential to political life. I think that harkens all the way back to Locke and Locke's distinction between political power, which is legitimate and based in popular sovereignty, for example, versus brute power or brute force, which is simply might is right. Those two things are distinct, and legitimate governments have to have political power, not just pure power. So basically, you would destroy politics itself. There would be nothing that we could legitimately call politics. Everything would just be power. If you took away this cause of faction, which is liberty. Which is just amazing to me, because I feel like it's such a compulsion by certain members who are in leadership positions to want exactly that. There's this amazing quote by George Orwell in his essay he wrote called The Road to Wigan Pier. And he's talking about how every socialist he ever knew never actually liked the members of the working class that they claimed to be working on behalf of. And he said the reason why they don't like them is because these people look at the world like it's a chessboard, and they get annoyed when the pieces don't do what they're supposed to do. So really it's about that idea of we're gonna eliminate chaos, we're gonna eliminate instability, we're gonna make things just the way that we see things need to be just. The only thing we need to do that is to eliminate the cause of faction and eliminate liberty. And then the second cause of faction is the reason of man is fallible. So we're fallible. Human beings are fallible. How is that a cause of faction, first of all? Our fallibility, how is that a cause of faction? Yeah.
We can believe things are true.
Yes, yeah, we can form a whole group of people around a common interest, and that interest could be opposed to somebody else's, and ours could be completely right, and it could also be completely wrong. And then there could be another group which has the opposite interest formed, which they could be completely right or they could be completely wrong. So as long as you have that possibility of people being both right and wrong, and able to form groups together about their whatever they think is right or wrong, that infallibility can't both be right, but they can both have interests and passions being expressed. That is going to cause factions. Now, why does he say we can't just eliminate that as a cause? Why can't we eliminate human fallibility?
It's part of humanity, who we are. If
Yeah.
someone that makes a really compelling speech, it could be about, why everyone should go buy the new Honda CRV and then rally everyone to the cause and burn any car that's not. You just
Yeah,
can't,
that's-
you can't.
Basically, what he says is that even if you were to eliminate, even in scenarios where people have like a really great government and everyone really gets along and everyone's really harmonious, what do people do? They invent things to argue about, right? This is like Team Jacob or Team Edmund or whatever. What's his name? Edward, right? Like how much of your life have you spent on these ridiculous internet debates that are totally 100% meaningless, and we do it because we love it, right? So he says it's impracticable. It's impractical. And so the first is unwise. It's unwise to eliminate liberty. You essentially destroy any hope of legitimate politics if you destroy liberty by attempt to eliminate faction that way. Second thing he says, it is impracticable because this is just how human beings are. If only we could transform human beings into something other than what they are, then we could have a really great government, right? But this is not how the founders thought. The founders, it's really amazing to read through these texts and see like how, while at the same time, like, you know, the Declaration of Independence, for example, having these ideals of all men being equal and all these things, representative government, popular sovereignty, you know, checks and balances, justice, etc. All these ideals, and yet at the same time, like, they were not idealistic about how human beings are. So they're always kind of aware of what the material that you're building out of. Like, you want to build something great, you can't just idealize the material of which you're building that and have it actually come to fruition. It's just going to collapse on itself. It's going to be impractical. It's going to be unwise. All these things. You have to take into account what is human nature. What are we working with? And this really obviously goes back to Machiavelli. We talked about this a lot with Machiavelli. Machiavelli was very aware how to be an effective ruler. One of the things it requires knowing sort of the limitations of human beings, what human beings are actually like, as opposed to how we like to think of ourselves, because we're also very proud. Okay, so the latent causes of faction, they're sewn into the nature of man. People just love to argue, even if it's meaningless. He goes on a little bit more. I don't want to go into regulation. We're going to want to pick up here. I want to skip a little bit. So the principal task, he says, continuing, the principal task is the regulation of these various, so you can't get rid of it. So what is it to be a legislator? What is it to be a modern legislator? It's the regulation of these various and interfering interests that form your principal tasks. So you want to go into government, you want to rule in this kind of government where we're not going to try to eliminate the causes of faction. We're going to try to rule in a way that's actually political, actually legitimate, actually in accordance with human nature. We're going to have to spend our time managing factions. Doesn't that sound fun, right? Like, put it that way. I'm sure you're all signing up to be like, go run for office, right? You're going to manage factions. And it's what makes being a ruler in a republic incredibly frustrating, because no one ever just all agrees on anything. But that's a part of it. It's a part of it. So what you can do then is were you gonna add, Charlie?
Oh, I was just gonna say, along these lines is, like, if you can't get rid of the factions, one of the ways is to shift the focus of what these factions are focusing on. That's what they did in Rome with the gladiators and stuff. And in sports nowadays, it's the people are gonna argue about something, give them something else to argue about, something else that they can support. And that
Yes.
can kind of help distract from, larger issues.
Yeah, and I mean that kind of gets to what his second solution to the effect is. Really speaks to that. There's a solution he gives before that though. So you can't modify the two causes, but there are two effects. So one of the effects of the first effective faction, he says, is that you can be part of a small group, or what's the smallest group of all is the individual, right? So this comes down ultimately to individual rights. So you have a right to have your own interests. You have a right to have your own passions. And those are the first thing that's under threat here that he mentions. So this is where the majority, there happens to be more people who have an interest or a passion that is opposed to yours, and then you just get crushed, right? Your minority interest, smallest minority is the individual. So minority groups, minority individual, the individual itself get crushed in this situation. So how can you moderate that effect? What is Madison's solution to that? You can't get rid of the cause, but you can actually ameliorate the effect of it. That. So this is the paragraph. He says if a faction consists of less than a majority. How do we get relief from that? No, sorry, I flipped it. The first is that when a faction is, we're talking about when a small faction, a minority faction, oppresses the majority. Let's start with that. So there's a small group, they're oppressing the majority. They have an interest that is opposed to the passions and interests of the majority. What's the solution to that? That's the easier one.
Oh, it's like above.
Yes, so the main thing is what is called the Republican principle. The Republican principle, the Republican principle, the Republican principle. Incredibly important. It's like the foundation of any republic actually existing is you have to have the ability to vote. So if there is somebody that you elected, now they're in a minority, right? Because the rulers are fewer than the many who elect them. You have a minority, you can vote them out come the next election if they rule in a way that oppresses you. Right? This is the way that you protect the majority against minority factions. Minority takes power, you don't like how that powerful group operates, you can kick them out of office. So foundational to every republic is that you have elections and that people, those elections are actually free and fair, and those elections are believed by the people to be free and fair. Now, does anyone know the percentage of people in 2020 who think that Joe Biden was elected through fraud? Does anyone know the latest statistics?
I know it's less than half,
No.
so.
56%. Can you have a republic, whether or not you think he cheated, or he, by he I mean whoever was in charge of his election, but whether or not you think he was elected through cheating, can you have a republic if the people, the majority, think that your elections are riddled with fraud? That is not sustainable. This is a very serious problem. I mean, it wasn't just in 2020 this came out. It's really fascinating. Like, you go back to like 2000, 2004, 2006, and it's like Democrats. What are they claiming? Fraud, machine fraud, vote flipping, vote switching, hanging chads, you know? Going all the way back to 2000.
The Russians.
The Russians, 2016, the Russians, Russian interference. I remember like every time I went anywhere public, it was CNN, and it was like, wow, the Russians, we're still talking about the Russians for years. Like every doctor's office, every flight I took. The Russians. Because I don't have cable, so I don't see any of the main news shows. But yeah, you cannot have a this is incredibly destabilizing. Speaking of destabilizing chaos and injustice, you have a scenario where the people don't believe your elections are free and fair, and you don't have a republic anymore. Yeah. Yeah. So that's the first thing he addresses. You can see how central it is, and it also then should really put a sense of urgency into you to look into this situation with the elections. What is going on? How are we going to fix this? This is a really urgent problem. America's really currently facing. Audits. Yes, well, there's ways that if banks are accused of stealing money or not giving you the right amount of money, there are ways to deal with that, and that is called an audit. Any business regularly goes through an audit. So why are we not regularly auditing our elections? I don't know. I can't figure this out. Auditing is different from recount, by the way, because if you're recounting fraudulent balance, is that an audit? Does that show you if you had corruption or not? No. If you think the bank is giving you counterfeit money or someone's giving you counterfeit money and they just take the money and go, no, look, it adds up to 100. Like, no, but those 2 20s are fake. That's monopoly money, dude. All right, so then the second thing is a harder thing. So when the faction is a majority, how do you protect the minority against the majority faction? one thing, I think we remarked on this earlier, this is where like majority interests are supposed to become more refined through having the idea of representative government. Is that what you're thinking of? The idea of representative government is that there are people who have better skills, better knowledge, better wisdom, who can actually direct those interests or passions in a way that's more conducive with, you know, not oppressing a minority or in the common good as a whole. So that's just the representative democracy itself is one solution to that.
No, sorry, I meant like voting representatives, like one representative for every like 15,000.
Oh, yes. The other thing is, yeah, so,
Like
you
the
just like,
electoral college.
yeah, so having, representative over, like, the size of what you're representing. Could you just give, like, one or two, how does that deal with that?
Like, if you have a population of, I don't know, say 25,000 or 20,000 people, and then 3/4 of them all say one thing, and then so that's 50,000, and then you have a little small group of 5,000 people that are all getting smushed by what these other 15,000 people are saying. Well, you can still have it like divided up by, like, well, I guess I picked bad numbers, but you can, or like Wyoming has 2 seats in the Senate, and California has 2 seats in the Senate.
Yes.
And there's a bunch more people in California.
Yes,
than
okay,
there
the
are in
electoral college is a really good example of how we deal with majority factions. So if you don't want the country to be ruled simply by where the majority of the population lives, because in a massive republic, the interests of somebody in California or New York City are very different than somebody in Iowa or Missouri. And shouldn't those people have some say? Should they just be completely crushed? So that's one of the things we see directly reflected in the Constitution, is that you have the states equalized in a sense by each being given the same number of seats when it comes to the Senate. And then the main way that majority faction is controlled through its effects. So Hamilton gave this principle that we're going to enlarge the sphere, enlarge the orbit of the republic. We're going to make it big, which is really a very modern principle, because if you look at any republic of the past, and this was a tenet of political science, if you want to have a republic, it has to be small, because interests have to be similar enough that people can actually agree. Right? Makes sense. You want rule by the people have to rule. It means the people have to be a people. They can't just be having completely different interests. They have to have something that's recognizable as their interest. So you have to have coordination, and this is what there's the authors of the Anti-Federalist Papers. Very fascinating to read the Anti-Federalists. This is exactly one of the things that they argued. Is you cannot have a large commercial republic because you won't have the rule of the people. You won't have anything that's identifiable as a common interest. But the Federalist authors take that and turn it around. Like, no, that's going to be a good thing. Why do they think that's a good thing? How can that possibly be? Get back to Charlie kind of indicated it earlier when he was talking about distracting people with gladiators and stuff. But what happens is that when you enlarge the sphere of the republic, you actually multiply interests. And if you multiply interests, as you multiply them, as you increase them, what do you think happens to the chance that any one interest could become a majority interest? The majority people could have the same interest or could have the same passions. So you're multiplying interests. What do you think the chance of having any one of those interests coalesce into a majority interest? Does it go up, stay the same, or go down? Down. It decreases the chance that you can have anything forming as a majority interest. So that's what you do. You actually increase the number of factions. Sounds counterintuitive. But the authors of the Federalist Papers like, no. This is our new modern political science. This is what we're adding to the modern political scientists. This is uniquely American. This is actually really going to help us. We're just going to have this massive republic, so many interests that it'll be just too difficult to coalesce and actually form a majority that would really be able to oppress a minority interest. And there's a lot to be said for that. It actually, Plato in his book The Republic has a description of democracy. And a democracy is like where you see all kinds of things. You see all the regimes. You see elements of monarchy. You see elements of aristocracy, elements of tyranny, elements of oligarchies, you get all these things, this mixture of kinds of people that go along with that. And it's the only regime where you find philosophy. And basically he says democracies have so many interests and so many multiples of factions that you can kind of get away with anything because you just become unnoticed. You can kind of slip by unnoticed. And that's why philosophy can be tolerated in democracies, because other regimes are too orderly and then they notice the philosopher stands out like a sore thumb and immediately gets killed. So of course then Socrates actually was killed, but what Plato would say is that he did live till he was 70. In no other regime other than a democracy would he get away with questioning the regime for 70 years. Only in a democracy, and even then he's eventually killed. Okay, so that's Federalist 10. It was good. We spent more time than I thought we would on that. That's good to go through in detail. So Federalist 23. Because we're really going to see Federalist 51 comes back around to Federalist 10. We're going to make a full sort of circle here. So Federalist 23. Okay, so now they're going to really look particularly, they've established that we need a strong, we're established that we need a federal government, Now they're going to explore what form should this federal government take? What should it look like? And he starts off in 23. Sorry. Okay, oh, sorry, I skipped ahead to 47. I'm like, why do I not find 23 what I'm looking for? Yes, because I was looking for the wrong part of my page. Okay, so that's what he's going to look at here. This is Hamilton now. And first of all, he's going to say, what are the objects provided for by a federal government? So we want to know what it looks like, what form it's going to take, which of this thing that we're creating, what form should it take? Well, what is it supposed to do? Right? You want to know how something looks. You obviously want to know, well, what is it supposed to do? What function does it have? What object does it have? So we're going to derive the form from its object. And then we're going to be able to see, once we've determined what the objects of this federal government are, what it's supposed to do, what it's supposed to be able to accomplish, then we're going to be able to see what sort of powers would it need to be able to do those things. Right? Makes sense? Now we're going to see how much power it's going to need to accomplish those ends. And then we're going to see what kinds of people should be able to have that power. Where should that power be located? So he says the principal purpose answered by union are these: the common defense of the members, preservation of the public peace, as well as against internal convulsions as external attacks, the regulation of commerce with other nations and between the states, the superintendence of our intercourse, political and commercial, with foreign countries. So this makes sense. This is kind of answering all those, like this is where the Articles of Confederation have failed. They tried to organize, the states tried to organize themselves. They were not able to regulate commerce with other nations and between the states well. They couldn't superintend political and commercial intercourse with foreign countries well. They couldn't preserve the public peace well, and they couldn't, the common defense of the members they couldn't preserve well. So these are the objects. So the question is, how much power do we give to the federal government to accomplish these objects? Okay? So, first thing he says, when it comes to common defense, how much power should the federal government have? This also sounds maybe a little bit counterintuitive for people who are very wary of King George and his tyrannical powers, for example. This is like 1, 2, 3, 4. Fourth paragraph. If you look at the fourth paragraph, you should find something on this.
It ought to be clothed with all the powers needed to complete its execution of powers.
Yeah, and how much power is that when it comes to the common defense?
No limitation.
No limitation. Yeah. So is this not tyranny now that they are institutionalizing into their very form of government? What would be Hamilton's response? Yeah.
If a representative government isn't able to use every power that it has to defend itself, if the representative government is annihilated, there's no representative to like protect from tyranny. So if the government can preserve itself, then there's no representation anymore.
Right, so self-preservation is definitely essential, and can you put a measure on the degree of threat that you may face when it comes to your very existence as a country? He says that you can't define that. So how could you define the amount of power that the government has to defend, to do its object of defending the thing it governs? Because the threat is unquantifiable. You can't measure that. You can't know in advance what that is. We don't know. There's threats out there. They're mysterious. It's part of what it is to be a threat, is you don't know it exactly, right? People tend to be secretive when they are out to get you. So you need to have the power without limitation. This is Hamilton thinks very logically. I love reading Hamilton. He's like a logician. He just hammers you with logic. You can't oppose the logic. It's inevitable. Lincoln was the same way, a country lawyer. Lincoln was very logical, and he hammers you with logic. You have to assent to what he's saying. So the quantity of power needed is that basically what it comes down to in this argument is that you need, if these are what your objects are for the federal government to accomplish, you need to have a very energetic government. You need to have a government that actually is invested with a lot of power in order to be able to fulfill these tasks. Then one of the questions that arises is, well, you know, even if that's the object of federal government, why couldn't we have the power to carry out that object on the states instead? Wouldn't that seem safer than putting it all in a centralized body? Do you remember his response to that?
Well, I don't necessarily know. I kind of know like our founding documents response in general, and that's the idea of the subsidiary that we were talking about earlier, which is that there's no way that the states can do that cohesively on their own. There needs to be a supreme authority over the state. Otherwise, you just get the Articles of Confederation almost.
Exactly. Yeah, so he says, is there not a manifest inconsistency? This is one of the, like, maybe the third last paragraph. Is there not a manifest inconsistency in devolving upon the federal government the care of the general defense and leaving it in the state governments the effective powers by which it is to be provided for? Is not a want of cooperation the infallible consequence of such a system? Exactly that point. So you can't say that it is the object, we're going to have this federal government to do this thing, and then take away the power to do that thing and give it to the states, because what ends up happening is that the states can't coordinate to achieve that object. So you get the Articles of Confederation replicated all over again. You did not solve the problem that they're supposed to solve. Okay, next time, we'll do, so I'll send out the list. I'll send it out.